In 1978, Iran was one of the most important American allies in the Middle East. The Shah had one of the largest military budgets in the region. Western companies were doing business in Tehran. The country was building highways, universities, and a nuclear program. It had oil money, military power, and a secret police force that kept everything under control. 1 year later, the Shah was gone. The American embassy was seized. Diplomats were taken hostage, and his 78-year-old cleric, who had spent 15 years in exile, had become the supreme leader of an Islamic republic that declared the United States its primary enemy. It happened fast, and it shocked nearly everyone: the CIA, the British government, the Shah himself, and many Iranians who supported the revolution but had no idea where it would end up. To understand how, you have to go back further than 1979. You have to understand what Iran was, what was done to it, and why so many different people, secular leftists, religious conservatives, students, merchants, and clerics, all decided, at the same moment, that the Shah had to go. Iran in the 20th century was a country constantly pulled between its own ambitions and the interests of more powerful outside forces. In 1951, a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry, oil that had been controlled primarily by Britain. The move was enormously popular inside Iran. It was seen as a reclaiming of national sovereignty. Britain and the United States saw it very differently. In 1953, a CIA and British intelligence-backed coup removed Mossadegh from power and restored Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi to full authority. That coup never left Iranian political memory. It confirmed, for millions of Iranians across the political spectrum, that their sovereignty was conditional, that foreign powers could and would intervene whenever their interests were threatened. The Shah used his restored power to build a modernizing but repressive state. His program, called the White Revolution, pushed land reform, expanded education, gave women the right to vote, and aggressively industrialized the economy. On paper, the statistics looked impressive. In practice, the benefits were uneven, the pace of change was disorienting, and the political system remained entirely closed. There was no meaningful parliament, no free press, no legal opposition. Dissent was managed by Savak, the Shah's secret police, trained in part by the CIA and Israel's Mossad. Savak monitored, arrested, tortured, and disappeared people who posed a threat to the regime. The exact number of political prisoners and victims is disputed, but no serious historian denies that Savak operated with brutal effectiveness. The Shah's modernization also created a cultural tension that ran deep. Western dress, Western music, Western influence were visible in Tehran's upper and middle classes, but much of the country, the rural poor, the urban bazaar merchants, the religious establishment, felt that Iranian and Islamic identity was being deliberately eroded. The clerical establishment had deep roots in Iranian society, control over religious schools, and a network of mosques that reached into every community. The Shah clashed with them repeatedly. He saw their influence as backward and threatening. They saw him as an agent of foreign culture and foreign powers. Into this environment stepped Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini had been a thorn in the Shah's side since the early 1960s. He was not simply a religious conservative. He was a political theologian who argued that Islamic clergy had not just the right but the obligation to govern. He had been arrested, exiled, and eventually settled in Najaf, Iraq, and later in Paris. From exile, his sermons were recorded on cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran, where they circulated widely. His message was consistent. The Shah was a puppet of America and Israel. Iran's wealth was being stolen. Islam was under attack. The people had the right and the duty to resist. By the mid-1970s, the conditions for a mass movement were building fast. The oil boom of the early 1970s had flooded Iran with money and then created problems the system couldn't handle. Rapid urbanization, inflation, and inequality generated widespread frustration. The gap between the wealthy, westernized elite and the urban poor was increasingly visible and increasingly resented. When oil revenue slipped in the mid-1970s, even the economic argument for tolerating the Shah weakened. Jimmy Carter, who became U.S. President in 1977, made human rights a part of American foreign policy. This created an opening, modest but real, where the Shah felt some pressure to ease repression slightly. Political prisoners were released. Some dissent was tolerated. It was not designed to encourage revolution, but it created enough space for opposition to begin organizing openly. Then came a cascade of events in 1978 that nobody quite controlled. In January, a government-linked newspaper published an article attacking Khomeini personally. It triggered protests among religious students in the city of Qom. Security forces fired on the crowd. The death set off a cycle that is deeply embedded in Shia Islamic tradition, 40-day mourning periods, which meant that every 40 days, new commemorations became new protests, which led to new crackdowns, which produced new martyrs, which meant new mourning cycles. Through 1978, the protests grew. Strikes paralyzed key industries. Oil workers walked out, cutting the revenue the regime depended on. In September, in what became known as Black Friday, security forces opened fire on protesters in Tehran's jail square. Dozens were killed. The exact number is still disputed. The event crossed a psychological line for many Iranians who had been watching from the sidelines. What made the revolution so powerful was who joined it. This was not a single faction uprising. Secular nationalists who remembered Mossadegh, Marxist and leftist guerrilla organizations, liberal intellectuals, the merchant class of the bazaar, and the religious masses all converged on a single objective. They wanted the Shah gone. What would come next was a question most of them hadn't seriously worked through. Khomeini was the figure they could all project onto. Secular leftists thought he was a figurehead who would step back once the Shah fell. Religious moderates thought he represented traditional values without political theocracy. Almost everyone underestimated the precision and determination of his actual vision. The Shah, increasingly ill with cancer and reportedly indecisive, tried a mix of concessions and crackdowns that satisfied nobody. In January 1979, he left Iran, officially on vacation. He never returned. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini flew back to Tehran from Paris. Millions lined the streets. When a journalist on the plane asked him what he felt returning to Iran after 15 years, Khomeini reportedly said, "Nothing." The revolution moved quickly to consolidate power and quickly to exclude those who thought they'd been part of it. A referendum was held in March 1979. Iranians were asked a single yes or no question, Islamic Republic or not. The wording gave no alternative. The result was an overwhelming yes. A new constitution was drafted that embedded Khomeini's concept of velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, at its center. Under this doctrine, ultimate political authority belonged not to elected officials but to the supreme religious leader. Khomeini became that leader. The groups that had helped bring down the Shah began to be systematically removed from power. Liberal nationalists, leftists, and Marxist organizations found themselves labeled as enemies of the new order. Many were arrested, executed, or forced into exile. The revolution ate significant portions of its own coalition. Then came November 1979. A group of radical students stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage. Khomeini endorsed the seizure. The hostages were held for 444 days. The crisis destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency, cemented Iran's isolation from the West, and defined the new regime's relationship with the United States in terms that have lasted ever since. In September 1980, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, with tacit support from several Western and Gulf states, invaded Iran, expecting a quick victory over a country in revolutionary chaos. What followed was an 8-year war that killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. Rather than destabilizing the new regime, the war rallied Iranians around it. The Islamic Republic used the conflict to consolidate its internal authority and eliminate remaining domestic opposition. By the time the war ended in 1988, Iran had been completely transformed. The cultural changes were sweeping. Dress codes enforced by morality police, restrictions on music and alcohol, separation of men and women in public spaces, and a media environment under tight clerical control. Economically, the country was exhausted by war and squeezed by sanctions. Politically, power was firmly embedded in the revolutionary institutions. The supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards, the Guardian Council, that exists to this day. The 1979 revolution remains one of the most consequential political events of the 20th century. It reshaped the Middle East, redefined the relationship between Islam and governance, and set the terms of the conflict between Iran and the United States that neither side has resolved in the decades since. It also contains a lesson that has not aged. Revolutions are almost never controlled by the people who start them. The coalition that brought down the Shah was genuinely broad. The outcome was genuinely narrow. Those who thought they were fighting for democracy, for socialism, or simply for national dignity against foreign interference found that the movement they had joined had a very specific destination in mind. The grievances that drove people into the streets in 1978 were real. The foreign interference, the repression, the inequality, the cultural displacement, none of that was invented. but real grievances, in the hands of determined political actors with a clear ideology and total commitment, can be channeled in directions that millions of participants never voted for and never wanted. Iran in 2025 is still governed by the system Khomeini built. It has been challenged by reform movements, by mass protests, most recently by the Woman, Life, Freedom uprising that followed the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022. The system has survived each one, whether it continues to is one of the open questions of our time. What 1979 made clear is that no regime, however powerful, however well-armed, however backed by foreign allies, is permanent, and that what comes after can be just as consequential as what was overthrown.